always an exciting endeavor for me to talk about weather data and how we match that up with real-world situations. The whole thing about the Cattle Comfort Advisor is it really is a new tool for farmers and ranchers as they look at taking care of their animals. So it's really a tool to add to the things that they're already doing. Doesn't replace anything, it just puts numbers to things that they've already seen in their cattle. If you look at my background, I am not a meteorologist or a climatologist. I'm really a production ag person. I come out of a background in vegetables and have a certified professional horticulturalist certification as well as certified crop advisor. And I've been at this, as you can see, for 16 years, so been at it for a number of years. When you start looking at this project, how was it funded? Well, it was funded through a USDA AFRI grant, actually a beef and drought grant, that is kind of a companion project to the grazing cap. And Chris Richards worked on it, Megan Rolfe, Rafal Jabrinsky, Michael Platt, and myself. So a lot of different folks involved and a lot of different institutions when you start looking at the expertise. So we've taken a lot and pulled that all together. Of course, today, you know, we're coming through on a webinar with the Great Plains Grazing group, and you can go to their website and there's more webinars, lots of other resources, fact sheets, and as Amber said, we'll get these slides posted from today as well. So I am not a livestock expert, but I've spent a fair amount of time now over the years looking at cattle behavior and then seeing how that relates back to our Cattle Comfort Advisor, the heat stress, cold stress kind of situation. This is one of the first group of cattle that I ran across that really caught my attention. Here you've got all these animals trying to crowd in just under a billboard sign shadow to try and keep themselves cool. What we'd much rather see is, in terms of cattle production, we like to see those animals out grazing. You can see these animals are separated. They're calm, they're not looking around, they're not worried about anything, and they're really in a nice spot for grazing. This happened to be in the evening on a very mild day. And then we get to a picture like this, and this is, to me, a very interesting picture because we've got a large number of animals and they're all doing different things. So way in the background, we've got some Black Angus that are actually kind of leaving the situation. We don't know what they're going towards, but they don't look like they're in any kind of heat stress. Again, we look around, we see the animals are pretty well separated, which means they're kind of calm. We can see some laying down in the grass to rest or to cool themselves, some over in the mud to get a little bit more cooling, and then you see the animals down actually in the pond. So one of the things that we're going to do as we look at the numbers for the Cattle Comfort Advisor, remember that it relates back to animal behavior. So this is the day that I was just showing you. It's this is 2 p.m. July 25th, 2017. That's Eastern Daylight Time. So we were actually in the central part of the nation on this July afternoon, and I took that picture and was actually driving through the on Highway 283. And so with that, driving on Highway 283, I was able to catch that picture of those animals around that pond. When I went back and looked at the Cattle Comfort Advisor, you can see that we were in that area of 105 to 104. So we were right on the border of those animals moving into what we might think of as a more of a heat stress situation as we get above that 105. But those animals in their behavior showed that things were just fine. They had plenty of cooling capacity where they could get into that pond, and their behavior didn't show that there was any kind of heat danger. So this is the category levels that have been developed with the Cattle Comfort Advisor. Heat danger would be greater than 105. And in that situation, depending on where you're at, either in a feedlot or out in a pasture type setting, animal deaths could exceed 5%. Heat caution would be above 85%. There we're looking at a drop in gain, so decreased production, and we can have some conception problems begin to show up there as well. Comfortable range is pretty large, 15 to 85, and that's really assuming that we get into conditions where the animals have a chance to develop that winter coat and get some of that inner fur down near their body developed. Cold caution would be 15 to minus 20. And the main thing here that producers are doing is looking at increasing the animal feed quantity and quality typically. The other thing that they also have to pay attention to in those colder temps is really keeping a water source open for the animals. And then as we get into below minus 20, then we get into a really a cold danger situation where we need to bring animals at risk closer, where we can monitor those or give them added protection. Windbreaks are always a plus at that level. And this is the color coding that we have for those different categories. So you can see the coldest part of the chart would be in the purples. Then we move into the blues. Comfortable is gray. We move into yellow. We get into the caution, and then into the red with a danger situation. So the Cattle Comfort Advisor really uses 4 different weather variables, takes air temperature and adjusts that by relative humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. The traditional cold stress model was air temperature and wind speed only. And now with the new Cattle Comfort Advisor cold stress indicator, the sunlight increases the temperature, makes the animal feel warmer. The wind speed is still included as it was in the traditional model, but now we also have relative humidity added into there. Looking at heat stress, the traditional models had air temperature adjusted by relative humidity. This is still the primary animal and human heat stress models that are out there. If we look at the Cattle Comfort Advisor, adding in sunlight, that actually increases the heat load, whereas wind speed will cool and decrease that heat load. So adding those in really makes a big difference, and we'll see that a little bit later on. The model was developed by Terry Mader, Leslie Johnson, and John Goghan. And they published this as a comprehensive index for assessing environmental stress in animals back in 2010. And this is a reference to that. We also have that on the Cattle Comfort Advisor website as well. So when we look at those heat and cold stress categories, we start out with the heat danger, caution, comfortable, caution, and danger in the cold. And we already went over some of those impacts. The heat and cold impacts really varies. So animals, just like humans, they get acclimated to both cold and heat. There's going to be breed differences, the hair coat, how much they've developed, and how much, as we move from winter to spring, how much they've lost of that winter hair coat has an impact on the heat. Hydration, of course, is always important. And so anything we can do, especially in heat situations, to increase the water drinking by the cattle really helps. And then when we look at cold, first thing that ranchers think of is the quantity and quality of that feed. And then the other thing about heat is we can adjust that feed time to help the animal not add heat load to the day's heat load as they digest that feed. In terms of the heat and cold impacts, producers know that these add up, they're cumulative, and there's also recovery. So if we have a really cold day, but that doesn't last, a week, and we move into some warmer situations, or the winds come down, that can help those animals recover from cold. When we start looking at heat, we're really looking at cooler nights, where the animals can dissipate that body heat and begin to recover. And one of the things is rapid temperature changes really do encourage respiratory disease. So that whole health situation, we may not have animals where we actually have them die or have critical kinds of stress situations, but we may see a rapid change in temperature that really brings on the respiratory disease problems and adds to their overall health problems. So in terms of the caution cold stress, just to repeat what we've talked about and sum that up, so we're looking at between 15 and minus 20. We want to increase that feed quantity or quality, and we do have that increased risk of health issues. If we get into the cold stress in terms of danger, that's really where we see a risk of animal death. How those animals respond is really going to make a difference in terms of hair coat and what they've been acclimated to. And this is the danger cold. That's where it's critical for looking at both wind protection and close monitoring. When we start talking about the heat stress, that goes greater than 85 to 105. So we want to increase water availability. We want to avoid working cattle after 10 a.m. And that would be in terms of moving them through chutes or trying to get them loaded in order to move them to other areas. We want to increase air movement if at all possible. And controlling flies will help ease the animal. They won't be putting so much attention into that. And then that whole area of increased risk of health issues in conception and also the respiratory issues. Heat danger, this is where we get into the risk of animal death. Again, unacclimated animals, young or already ill, sick animals, or dehydrated animals. They're going to have much lower risk thresholds. And if that heat stress is bad enough and stays long enough, the animals don't have time to recover, and we get into day 2 of heat, we get into day 3, then we may need to look at cooling with either sprinklers or planning to come back with shade at a later time. But for a crisis or emergency situation, we're really going to have to look at coming in and cooling with sprinklers or water. So again, just going back to that index, because we're going to look at a lot of maps, but so I just wanted to get that before you again to kind of burn that into your brain. One of the things I wanted to do was just real quickly go through what the additive, both negative and positive effects are of some of the weather variables. So to do that, can't really do that on the National Cattle Comfort Advisor website right now, but I can on the Oklahoma Mesonet website. So if you're not familiar with the Oklahoma Mesonet, we have 120 sites across the state, and data comes in from that every 5 minutes. So we can get a very precise estimate of what's going on. And one of the things that Oklahoma, because it's a transition state, we can have some really wild swings in weather. This was a map from February 7th of last year, where we were seeing some heat stress, across the state coming in. You can see the gray areas up in the panhandle where animals would be comfortable. And then as you look across the state, some heat stress on that. The very next morning, at 9:40, we had a cold front come through. So we've got animals that were in almost a mild heat stress situation the day before, and now they're in a cold stress situation very soon after that. So some really big shifts in terms of what those animals go through. So this was just taking a look at some of the situations that we can run into. This was at Goodwell, and wanted to take a look at a cold caution situation where you can see in the second or third column, I should say, the air temperature was 18 degrees. But if you look at the cattle comfort degrees, we're down at 2.1. And as we go across, you see relative humidity, the wind speed, and the sunlight level, and you see the corrections. So humidity was adding another 3.8 degrees in terms of cold. The wind was adding 12.6. And the sunlight, because the levels were so low, it actually was a negative as well. And then looking just a few hours later, you can see that the air temperature has risen about 10 degrees, but our comfort index has jumped about 18 degrees. And so when we go across and look at relative humidity, wind speed, and sunlight, we can see that the humidity correction didn't change all that much. The wind, we're actually getting quite a bit of cooling with wind, but the big difference is in the sunlight correction. So that sunlight really does add nicely to the comfort of the animals in the winter conditions. Looking at some examples of heat, this is looking at two sites, and they're across the state from each other. Woodward would be out in the west, Cookson in the east, and you can see that the cattle comfort numbers are very close to each other. So at Woodward, we're looking at 100.8, and the air temperature is 92. If you go down and compare that with Cookson to the east, we're looking at 99.7, so about 1 degree difference in terms of the cattle comfort advisor. But now look at air temperature, and we're looking at about 8 degrees difference if we round those up. So going across and looking at the relative humidity, the thing that really jumps out is Cookson, we're at 70% relative humidity, and you can see the relative humidity in Woodward at 35. And if we carry that over to the humidity correction, we can see the humidity is adding 1 degree of heat load in Woodward, but it's adding 6.5 degrees over in Cookson. The other thing is looking at the wind correction. There's typically a little more wind out in Woodward, and you can see the wind speed at 6.5. We're getting a wind correction there of 7.6. So that's a nice cooling impact for those animals. And if you look down at Cookson, they were at 5.6, and that's a 6.3. So it gives you an idea of how much that humidity can add to the load, but also what kind of increases we get from the sunlight and the benefit for heat that we get from wind. So the challenge for ranchers is really to try and keep their animals in that comfort range as much as possible. Animals are going to gain more, conception rates are going to be much better, their overall health is going to be much better. And I wanted to just go through some extremes. This is an example of some cold extremes. This is from January 1st, 2018 at 7 a.m. So for the central part of the state or the nation, it would be 6 a.m. And of course, as we move off to the west, earlier. And if you look in the dark purple areas and go up to the north into especially Montana, in the North Dakota border, you'll see minus 54, minus 52. So we can get some really low values. And you see there's an area up there where we're right at the Canadian border, we're at minus 59, but just a little bit south in Montana, minus 27. So we can have some real differences as we move from location to location as the weather changes on us. This would be an example, July 21st, of an extreme heat event. And what is interesting about what the Cattle Comfort Advisor provides is we really get an idea of how much heat load we can get way up north. So if you look at the Texas you'll see that we've got a fair number of places that are up above 110. And as we move into Oklahoma, we see the predominant majority of our locations are above 110. And we see that in Kansas as we go north. We see that in Nebraska. And we even see some of those high numbers up in South Dakota. In fact, right at the border of South Dakota and North Dakota, we have a location that's at 116. And one of the reasons why that is so important is those animals up north, they're not going to be acclimated towards the heat. So if that lasts 2 or 3 days, the risk of those animals getting into severe situations is pretty high. One of the other things that the National Cattle Comfort Advisor allows us to do now is we can actually look at systems as they move through. So this is an example, and I just wanted to run through this almost like an animation. So this is January 10th, 2018 of this year, and it's at 1 p.m. And if we just advance this in 3-hour increments going out, we can really see that cold as it developed and then came in, sliding in from the north across the country. Because the Cattle Comfort Advisor does heat and cold on a continuous basis, we actually can use it to see the heat loads down in the Florida as well as the cold up above. So this was at 24 hours, and if we continue to advance that in 3-hour increments across the nation again, we can see how things are changing. And I'm going to stop it here again because as you look in the gray areas in the southeast, you can see numbers in the 50s. And then as that cold is coming through, you can see dropping down into single digits and into negative Cattle Comfort Advisor numbers. And I'll go ahead and advance that. So this is at 48 hours. And that cold is kind of hung back just a little. This is in the afternoon at 1 p.m. And I'm going to advance it some more, going out to 72 hours. And we can see how that cold moves across the nation and really comes up to chill a large part. So we can advance and see how these systems move through because we update the National Cattle Comfort Advisor on an hourly basis. So this is the actual website, and you can get online. We have the different maps, 100% solar, we have a 60% and a 20%. And the reason why we have 3 different maps is that we don't have a good database of solar radiation. So we needed to come up with a way to do the different sunlight. So one of the shortcomings of this is that a cattle producer would need to look at their current conditions and see how those match up with the maps and what would be the best for them. We also each hour produce an air temperature, wind speed, and relative humidity map that producers can take a look at for reference. So the cattle comfort maps are updated each hour. We have 3 sunlight levels, that 100%, 60%, and 20%. The past maps go to January 1st, 2016. We do hope to move that back a little bit more into a longer range of past maps that are available. The code that was used, it was written in Drupal, which allows the website to automatically adjust to any screen size. And we did host that on Amazon Web Services to keep it separate from the actual mesonet production of products and data. So this is what it would look like on your phone, and it has a nice navigation little chart used by most sites with the 3 lines that open that up. The past data box, because it's written in that Drupal mode, really is sizable and easy to go through and pick and look at some past ones. So when producers are looking at the different sunlight levels, this would be something that they would typically use looking at their sky. This would be a 100% sunlight map that you'd want to use because the clouds are very light. They're really not obstructing much of the sun at all. As we get into more cover, we're going to move down to that 60% sunlight. These clouds are actually, there looks like there's a lot of them, but they're actually very high. And there's quite a bit of light that's being reflected. So there's still a lot of light that's coming down and would be hitting animals in an outdoor setting. And then we get into a 20% sunlight, and that's really where the sky is completely overcast. There's no broken cloud areas and pretty dark as well. So this is an example from Labor Day, September 4th, 2017 at 5 p.m. Just looking at the 100% sunlight levels, and you can see all of the red areas. The yellow moves up into Nebraska and clear up into the northeast, and of course we've got red areas moving up on the western states all the way up into Washington. As we look at 60% sunlight, now those reds, those real bright reds, have lightened, and there's less area of those, and the yellows have faded a little bit. We have more orange actually in this map, and then we get into the 20% sunlight level, and now we're starting to see quite a bit more yellow across the nation. We've lost all the red that was up in Washington coming down the west coast. We've got to get back down into the San Joaquin Valley to actually see the dark reds. And we really, as we move across the south, we really don't have any areas there that are red. So it really shows how the sunlight, getting some shade out there for those animals can really help. And this would just be the air temperatures. So we have that for reference. So at any point that we've looked at a national cattle comfort, we can go back and look at air temperature. We can look at wind speeds. And those are, that is 10-meter data, but it is calculated down to be at a 2-meter level. So those are reduced from the 10-meter. And then we have relative humidity as well as a percent. And one of the things that we do is we actually calculate what the watts per meter squared are. Each hour they change for every site across the nation. So we're taking the time of the day and the date and calculating a unique sunlight level for that hour at each of the locations across the U.S. So we do provide for reference the watts per meter squared for 100%, 60%, and 20% sunlight. The future that we have, we want to go ahead and match up cattle water intake to the cattle comfort heat stress levels. We'd like to add forecasts to the National Cattle Comfort Advisor map. And we also would like to move from that set image to more of an interactive map where people could zoom in and see more of their localized area to provide that ability as well. So with that, does anybody have any questions?
Al, I do have one. This is Amber. I haven't seen any in the chat yet, but for those of you who joined later, there is a chat function at the bottom of your Zoom window if you'd like to type in any questions. I know that you have a past, so you have past maps. Do you have any maps that have, do you have any like differential maps, like, you know, what is the cattle comfort index right now versus 24 hours ago? Or so I can see like the difference is it, you know, is it 5 degrees warmer than yesterday or 10 degrees warmer than yesterday or for any other sort of time period?
No, we don't, but that would be something really good to add in.
I think that might be good for people to kind of have a range of, you know, because I know we've had some major temperature fluctuations lately, and in some cases we've gone from heat extreme to cold extreme. Even in just Oklahoma, like different parts of the state will be in different ends of that comfort spectrum, as well as those sort of changes from day to day. And I know that can be a sort of specific and interesting management situation where one day you're trying to compensate for heat stress and the next day you're compensating for cold stress.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. No, we don't have those online right now. So
okay, there's a question that says, is this just for Oklahoma or are there plans to include all the states individually?
Yes, right now, we have this, it was developed here at the Mesonet, so we have a data source at the Mesonet for Oklahoma. When we went to the national, we're actually using NETAR data, which comes from the airports, from the National Weather Service. They're the ones that collect that data and make that available. So we don't have plans at this point to do individual states, even though a lot of them now have automated weather stations as well. So it certainly could be done. People could look at Oklahoma as a pilot project and take the formulas and move those to their state.